Okay, let us start. So, welcome everyone. It has been quite some time since we met. The last class we had the exam, and I could see most of you doing quite okay in the first sessional exam. Some of you have scored uh, quite well. At the same time, some of you have actually not even managed to pass. So for those people who are doing very badly in the exam, I will suggest you to please go and then check on the videos which we have discussed in the last class, because most of these questions were actually uh, set from the discussions that we had in those previous classes. And then these are very fundamental questions that I asked in the class. And if you were paying attention in the class, or even if you were surfing those videos later on, probably you could have been able to do better than this. But anyway, congratulations on your achievements. But you have to really do a little bit better on an average. Okay. So today we are going to start on a new topic, which is actually a part of the entire disaster management uh, terminologies, and it is quite important, which is also known as vulnerability. Before we start on the topic, I would like to a little bit refresh your memory. We have already not really uh, get a grasp of it. So far, we have discussed some terminologies which are very, very important with respect to the disaster management aspect. Uh, you may wonder why I am putting so much emphasis on the last classes only with these terms, because we have to first clear ourselves on the definitions and the terminologies, and then there, most importantly, the differences in between those terminologies. Once you are well accustomed with these definitions, then rest we can pick up. Okay. So the first thing that we discussed was the hazard, the natural hazard. Then again, we came to define what is a disaster, how these two things are different. So you at the same time have, apart from remembering the definitions, you should well understand the difference. Hello? Yes, someone was speaking? Ah, okay. So you should mute yourselves. Okay. Unless you have a question. Yes. Please mute yourself unless you have a question. So the differences that we discussed, the differences that we please mute yourself unless you have a question. So the differences that we discussed is very important, vital, and then the difference remains that, or the fact remains that a hazard at any moment of time can translate into a disaster depending on the geographical setting where it may cross the societal boundaries at any point of time. Okay, so then you also had an emphasis on the term of hazard and then the disaster and then hazard. With the definition, again, we attached few other components to it. For example, that hazard has a probability of occurrence, and then it can be expressed whether it is a big hazard or a small hazard in terms of the magnitude of the hazard. The magnitude has different parameters to be tested. For example, in case of floods, our velocity or the the extent or the volume of water. These are the various parameters which you can have a great grasp of the magnitude of the flood. Another thing that is also important, if you want to compare the magnitude of the floods that occurred in two different years or two different floods occurring simultaneously, possibly into different watershed or basins. So how can we compare that? We can compare those floods in terms of the return period. So if the return period is very big, that means if you have a 100-year flood or 150-year return period flood or 500-year return period flood, obviously the magnitude will be very big. At the same time, the probability of occurrence of these floods will be minimized. Okay, then if you this way you can compare the two floods that are occurring into different geographical settings. Okay, sometimes if you want to compare a flood that is occurring in Assam to a flood that may be occurring in a different adjacent area, so you have to first know which basin the flood is occurring, and then if you can find out what is the return period, you can find out which flood actually is the bigger flood. So that makes some sense. Okay, so again coming back and then going forward in this direction, we come to one very important terminology that is known as the vulnerability. So you may actually have uh, crossed into this particular word throughout your life in many different settings. So this probably is not the first time that you have heard the word vulnerability. So whenever you hear the word vulnerable or vulnerability, what exactly is the thing that comes into your mind? Can I just throw a question, open-ended question? So who would like to answer? What do you think when you hear the word vulnerable or vulnerability? Please, who would like to answer? Yes, somebody. What is our Tem Adad? The mother. Valentina. Are you all here? Have you, first of all, have you heard the word vulnerable or vulnerability before? Tell me this.
Yes, sir. We heard, but we don't know exact.
Ah,
You know.
okay, good, good, good. So, but vulnerable is more or less uh, in the same context probably you have been using to define who or someone may be quite susceptible to some kind of a danger or some kind of a threat. For example, if I would like to give you is first when you were here in Assam Downtown University for the first time, and then you had come from different places, and then you were a little bit tender at that age. Obviously, you were all adult, but even then, you were at a very tender age. So you have been grown up at a different situation, and then suddenly you have to leave that entire environment and then come here, and then you have to adjust yourself into a very different setting altogether. So, uh, in order to adjust yourself in the surroundings or the settings, you may find a lot of discomfort. There may be a lot of things which are new to you, which you have been probably doing here it for the first time. So, uh, depending on your individual ability to adapt to this change or the surroundings, uh, you probably have well versed to the old environment, the new environment. So that maybe in one sense, I can tell you that you had individual vulnerabilities. Some probably were very quick when you try to adjust to the surrounding and then you had been successful. Maybe some other people or some other fellow students or your batchmates, they probably had taken a longer time in order to adjust to the surroundings, to the hostel life, into the library, into the new environment, or whatever things that you had to do, because these things were entirely new. So ultimately, yeah, this is something that you were mm, forced to encounter because of your choices. Then, sometimes, depending on your individual capacities to adapt to it, you were good at it, or some of you were a little bit not that good at it. So that way, I can say that some of you were actually vulnerable to the surroundings or the situations which were actually quite new in the sense. So the more the vulnerable you were, you had probably spent a little bit more time in order to adjust yourself to the situation. Uh, Another thing, I like to give an example of vulnerability. Now, think it in terms of the immunity of your whole body. So even now, during the time of the pandemic, um, some people have different experiences. Some people, even they are well, probably within a secure environment, they may have infected or got infected with, with the disease. And then some people who probably were not well secured and then they had a kind of exposure. Probably they even just escaped the disease. So that depends on the individual immunity. So individual immunity can also be translated into some sort of vulnerability. Okay, so those who are more vulnerable are quick to get the disease, or those who are less vulnerable are probably uh, less likely to get the disease. So this vulnerability may come due to the profession, or maybe due to your individual immune system, or maybe many other things. Maybe your economic capacity to spend and secure yourself against the threat. For example, the frontline workers who are fighting this disease, they are supposed to be more vulnerable because why? They are constantly getting exposed to this disease. So in a way, we can say that among the general population, the doctors and the nurses, all the frontline workers, as we say, who are constantly dealing with the patients, they are supposedly more vulnerable. That is why the government also had an initial drive to vaccinate those people. So this you see even in the society within itself, there are different levels of vulnerability in every sector. Okay, so that is also the same thing that we are going to a little bit elaborate in the sense of the broader concept of disaster management. So vulnerability is actually, if I say, or I like to define it is, you can say it's a degree. It is the degree of loss or degree of damage. Okay, so it may be at the individual level, or it may be at the family level, or it may be at a broader community level, or even it may be at a macro level in terms of country. So, as a terms of country, you can analyze yourself how vulnerable we have been to the second wave of the pandemic. So, you can compare between two different countries. How vulnerable people are there who are in the developed country compared to us. So, you see, so this is the vulnerability. So, vulnerability can translate as the degree of loss. Okay, and now I would like to go far a little bit beyond to just elaborate on the definition. Uh, for example, um, think that there is a flood that is happening, okay? And then your house is situated on the left hand side or the left bank or the left floodplain of a river. And then across the river, there is a friend whose house is there. That is your friend whose house is there on the other side of the river. So your house is on the left bank and your friend's house is on the right bank of the river. Just take an example of a very imaginary situation. This is a hypothetical situation, a circumstantial situation. Okay? So, and then in the night, the water is overflowing the banks of the river in both sides. And then suddenly, both the houses, your house as well as your friend's house, is getting inundated. That means water is slowly increasing on the areas where these two houses are situated. Okay, now the idea is that I want to explain what vulnerability is. Your house is a concrete house, that means RCC or reinforced cement concrete house with all the codes and then all these procedures which were adopted in the construction of the house. And let us assume that it is a double-story house. On the other hand, the other side of the house or other side of the river, the house that we are talking about, which is your friend's house, that is, suppose a pole house, that is a bamboo thatched house. Okay, so it is not made of RCC. And then what is happening? There is a water level which is increasing on the both sides of the river bank. It's slowly increasing. Now there is a situation that comes that your house is inundated maybe 1.5 meter, and then your friend's house is also inundated more or less 1.5 meter. So if I want to explain which house is more vulnerable, then I'll have to see which house is more likely to be getting more damaged, even under the same circumstance of a 1.5-meter flood level. So, from your experience, or from your thoughts, or from your whatever knowledge, which house do you think will be getting more damage? The one which is an RCC house, or the one that is a pure bamboo thatched adobe house? Which one?
What's the another is what house?
Another one is suppose which is not an RCC house, which is a simple bamboo house.
So I think the friend's house will be
Uh,
collapse,
which house?
likely to damage.
Which house?
Friend's one,
Your friend's one.
right? Yeah,
Uh,
not the RCC one.
yeah, exactly. So you see, even if water level is same, 1.5 meter, by the virtue that these two houses are built out of different construction materials, they are likely to sustain different degrees of damage. Okay? And that degree of damage in terms of disaster management is known as vulnerability. It is same like you experience yourself. First, you come to a different environment out of your home setting. You are likely to get a damage. I mean, damage not in the sense that you get a physical damage, but there is undulation in your mindset, okay? Then you have to adjust to it. So that's short of the damage. So in this case, when I was talking about the flood incident, by virtue of different property of these two buildings, the bamboo house is more likely to sustain a bigger damage due to the flood water. So we can say that the bamboo house is more vulnerable, okay, than the RCC house, okay.
So,
Uh,
sir,
yeah.
you are, sir, mentioning likely to damage. So it means it should not damage.
No, no, no. See, again, likely means that that is a stochastic, probabilistic incident. You cannot say.
Yes.
You cannot say it will damage always. But which has a bigger probability of getting damage? So, in the whole physical world, the natural world, that is what I also reiterated in my one of my previous lectures. You cannot be 100% sure. So everything is stochastic, everything is probabilistic. So that is the most likely scenario. It may not happen also. There is even a chance that the RCC building will collapse, but even the bamboo house may remain at the same place. But that has a less likely probability. But in other things remaining mostly the same, the house,
So, sir,
uh,
vulnerability vulnerability most time we use in the probability terms. So, with what if it actual happens? So, suppose like just now example, after damaging the bamboo one and the concrete one, the cement one is not damaged. So we after seeing the situation, we cannot say that this one is more vulnerable than this one.
of course, you can say after you have noticed the result. So imagine the flood has gone. Then you went to see which house has sustained more damage. Then you have found out that the bamboo house sustained a bigger damage. Then you can conclude that bamboo house was more vulnerable provided the other factors remained the same. That is why I initially said this is a hypothetical situation. It is more likely that all factors will never be the same. But even then, in a hypothetical situation, we have to assume that the flood water level is same. We are only talking about one component of the flood, that is the water level. There are many other components of it. There is velocity, there is momentum, there is sedimentation, there is duration. So many other things are involved. So remaining all other factors to be same, if you are only talking about these two houses on the aspect of the water level, then probably highly likely is that RCC house would remain less damaged than the bamboo house. Okay, that is only on the water level. But again, if you take for example some other component of the plant, for example, if you consider that the velocity or the momentum of the water, okay, the RCC house is more likely to sustain a bigger momentum, or even with the same momentum, the RCC house will get less damaged than the house which is other than RCC, or maybe which is the other side of the river. So, what I like to reiterate again that vulnerability is some kind of a translation of a degree of damage. So, which house has sustained more degree of damage? If you have found out, then you can conclude that yes, this house is more vulnerable. So, if you have found out that the RCC house has sustained more damage, yes, you can still conclude that RCC house is more vulnerable. That is just a hypothetical situation I'm saying. There may be RCC house which will collapse. If I don't know, there may be some other many other factors, but most
So,
likely,
sir,
hmm,
when we're talking about vulnerability, so we have to be always compare the same amount of the hazards or maybe plot anything
of course,
earthquake.
of course. If you want to compare, if you want to compare two different uh, objects, two houses, or two individuals, then first of all, you have to assume the remaining situations to be the same. Then only your comparison will yield a formidable result. Otherwise, if you do not make the exterior situation similar, okay, which is known as the surroundings, then it is no point of comparing. So you cannot really get a good result if the surrounding situation doesn't remain the same. So the comparison itself will not yield you a valid result. Okay, so just imagine that vulnerable situation in terms of two houses. So if you're comparing which house, or if you want to really know which house is more vulnerable, then let the water go up to the flood. You go to the first house and you see if the walls are damaged, if the pillars are damaged, if there is some cracks in the foundation, if the roof is gone. So you assess the damage. Then again, you go to the second house, then you do the same kind of assessment. Then in your assessment, you must arrive at a result to know that, okay, this is a bigger damage. Then from there, you can conclude that this house is more vulnerable. So, okay, so this type of vulnerability, which is more likely due to the attributes of the building itself, or due to the physical attributes of a property itself, is known as the physical vulnerability. That is what I like to highlight. Physical vulnerability. So, vulnerability has got different classes. First of all, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is the degree of damage or degree of loss. What is a hazard? Hazard is the probability of occurrence. Okay? So, probability of occurrence of a natural event. Just these key words you should remember. Hazard is the probability of occurrence. That means whenever you talk about a hazard, immediately you should be able to relate this term hazard with something probable of occurring. Similarly, whenever you talk about vulnerability, then quickly or immediately you should be able to associate this term of vulnerability with degree of damage, degree of loss. Okay.
So,
So
sir,
yes,
if vulnerability, there is only one, like just now example you have given, there is no bamboo house, there is only like we can say concrete house, cement house.
yes.
So how could we calculate without comparing the another house, the vulnerability of the that concrete or a cement house?
See, normally vulnerability extends from 0 to 1. Later on, you will come to realize that these all things, whichever I mentioned, is numerically can be calculated. So 0 means there is no vulnerability. Okay, there is no vulnerability, and 1 means 100% vulnerable. So that
Okay.
within that two numbers, the vulnerability of different things keeps on changing. So if I say that you have zero vulnerability against, I don't know, any sort of a disaster, then probably you can be 100% sure that you are not going to really get affected by that particular situation or that particular environment. If I say that I can go to minus 50 degrees centigrade and then still I can get a swim in the ice cold water, I am not, I'm zero vulnerable. So that means I'm not affected by that environment. If I say that I am 50% vulnerable or zero point 0.5 vulnerability I have, if I do such kind of thing that I will catch the cold, then there is a 50% probability that you get a cold or you do not get a cold if you do some sort of thing like that. Huh? Yeah. So that vulnerability is actually an intrinsic part of the individual, or which is a little bit inbuilt in your system itself that will determine if you really are vulnerable or not. So in these two aspects, what I was saying, the two buildings, this comparison that I'm giving, that if the structural damage is happening or not, okay, due to the similar surroundings or situations of a flat. If we're only looking into that aspect and then trying to conclude vulnerability, that kind of vulnerability is known as physical vulnerability. Okay, so later on you will realize that there are many different kinds of vulnerability. The kind of vulnerability that I initially gave an example to you, that is your emotional vulnerability. You come from your home, you have a secured environment, you come to the university which is completely new, you have a different culture here, you have different languages, you are looking at people which are not really familiar to you. You are entering a classroom which is probably different than the classrooms that you were earlier accustomed to. So there may be a little bit of time that you will need to adjust to all the surroundings. You have a sea change of emotions. So if we compare yourself with some other student, if the other student is quickly adapting to that environment, I can conclude that your emotional vulnerability is a little bit more than the other student, because I assume that all the other surroundings to be same for all the students coming to our university. Actually, vulnerability itself is a very, very big chapter. So what we are trying to give you is a little bit of grasp the whole concept of vulnerability. And then later on, you will see that people have different classes of vulnerability. The kind of vulnerability here I show you is physical vulnerability. So what it is mentioned here, it may be determined by aspects such as population density levels, remoteness of settlement, the site, the design, and the materials used for critical. So blah 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 blah. Whatever it is saying, that is the definition given by UNISDR. So here, one of the important things that is said is that the design and the materials used for critical infrastructure. So critical infrastructure, if I like to highlight, is your, suppose you are building a house, you have the columns, you have the beams, you have the foundation. So these are kind of infrastructure. So what kind of materials you are using? In a lighter sense, if you look into different kinds of advertisements that are shown by television all the time, they say that okay, if you build a house with this kind of a cement, your house is stronger. That means your house is less vulnerable on the other hand. So that is depend, that is supposed to be depending on the kind of materials that are being used in the construction. Okay, it can be the materials, it can be the design. Design means if you are using RCC or if you're not using RCC. RCC is a design concept. So that again will determine if your house is more vulnerable or if your house is less vulnerable. Or you can compare between two different houses. Then again, remoteness of settlement. If you are really near to some source, or if you are farther away from the source, if you are building your house near to the river, or if you are building your house farther away from the river, that will also determine your house will be vulnerable or not, or whose house will be more vulnerable. So this is a remoteness of settlement. So if you are building your house too close to a hill, and then suppose the slope is being abruptly cut, then you are exposing yourself to a very vulnerable situation against a landslide disaster. Okay? Then again, population density levels. So imagine now situation in Delhi, and imagine the situation now which is in the northeastern states. Delhi has a much denser population. So if you are living in a very dense population, you are supposedly more vulnerable to this pandemic. This is a very live example of vulnerability. Population density levels will also determine if you are really vulnerable to a certain threat, or if you are less vulnerable to the similar threat. Okay, so these are various aspects, but all those aspects together combined is put into the basket which is known as a physical vulnerability. Okay, then remember again, vulnerability is nothing but, in plain words, we can say this is the degree of damage, degree of loss. What is a hazard? Hazard is a probability of occurrence of a natural incident. Okay, then comes to an example. Again, it says wooden homes are less likely to collapse in an earthquake, but are more vulnerable to fire. Uh, I would like to give this example that is in the backdrop of an earthquake hazard. So normally, when you are living in a concrete house, the walls are built with bricks. Then there may be cracks that may develop during an earthquake or strong ground shaking. And then at that point of time, if the walls collapse over a certain individual, at that point of time, he may sustain a greater damage because the bricks they are heavy. So most of these casualties, whenever we hear in terms of earthquake, is the after effects of some kind of a wall that may fall on the particular person, or there may be some objects which fall on the particular person. Very few incidences occur where people are killed when there is a total collapse of the building. Total collapse of the building is very rare if the building is uh, built or constructed following the guidelines that are prescribed. So normally the walls, if you are living in a more earthquake-prone zone, or we say that earthquake vulnerable zone, it is advisable that you do not put heavy materials in the construction of the walls. For example, if you go to Japan, it is one country where every week there is certain level of ground shaking that has been experienced by the people there, the population there. So it is in their culture to build houses and the walls not with the bricks but with the lighter materials like woods or bamboos or even with paper. Ah, ah. Anyone asking something? Ah. So this line explains this simple statement that if you are living in an earthquake prone zone and then you are making or constructing the walls particularly with bricks, you are more vulnerable to an earthquake disaster. But again, in case of a fire, if you are constructing your houses with paper or wood, in that case, you are more vulnerable. So you see, if you were if your house is situated in Japan, and then if your house is situated in Australia, in Japan you are more prone to earthquakes. In Australia you are more prone to forest fire. So different building materials, or even the same building material, will have different levels of vulnerability in these two different countries. Everything else remains the same. You have a one-story building, you have a same square feet building, but that building or that house is in, in the forests in Australia, or if that house is in the middle mega city in Japan, that will, depending on the material what with which you are constructing the building, uh, you will experience different levels of vulnerability. Okay, woods are easily caught by fire, which is not so in the case of the bricks. We have also fire-resistant bricks, but in case of an earthquake, that brick itself may be the reason why you are more vulnerable. That is what will be explained by this statement. Okay. Okay, we have some further minutes to go. So probably another 5 minutes, then this meeting will end. Then again, continuing with the vulnerability, we have learned so far that physical vulnerability is a very bigger component of vulnerability as a whole. And physical component of physical vulnerability is determined by the materials with which you are constructing the house, especially in case of a civil engineer, the type of construction, okay, or your nearness to the source of the hazard, uh, so on and so forth. But what about the other aspects of vulnerability, which we try to overlook more or less uh, on the discussion? As I said, vulnerability is a very big chapter. So the other important aspect or subclass of vulnerability we have to mention is the social vulnerability. What is a social vulnerability? Do you have some words to explain? Or what in your understanding is social vulnerability? So far you have already known what vulnerability is. Vulnerability is nothing but degree of damage or the likelihood of damage in case of a disaster. So how can you relate vulnerability to the social aspect of it whenever there may be a disaster or even during a normal situation? How will you try to relate societal aspects with vulnerability? See, this is an interdisciplinary subject. That is why it is even more interesting. You didn't have to be really hardcore mathematicians or I would say civil engineers in order to understand the subject. In order to understand, to grasp the subject, you have to keep your eyes and ears open for discussion, for new ideas. And these are the subjects or these are the fields where people are much in need nowadays. Okay, so till I discuss this thing further, I leave it open for you to think what maybe social vulnerability is. Okay, so tomorrow we will sit together for this discussion. But till then, I'd just like to hear from you. What do you think when you hear the word social vulnerability, or what exactly is coming into your mind right now? When you were faced with these two words, social vulnerability, do you have something to say? Ak akure bes or not thus? Okay. Then Damtardini. Damtardini, where are you? Are you from Arunachal? Huh?
Think, sir, uh,
Yeah.
it's all depend on the all depend on the their well-being, means how well an individual is and community is or a society is. So more they have, they are well,
Mm-hmm.
maybe more, economically everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the more their vulnerability will be decreased.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. So,
We can,
yeah.
it's depend upon everything, like whenever we see in the society what we see, we can say as a their society fair,
Yeah.
no, no, their per capita income also, we can say that if there is a more income, more economically growth in the society, we can say more or less vulnerability in the society also.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So anyway, we will sit together tomorrow. We'll have a little bit elaborate discussion on this thing. But till then, whatever you were saying, I rightfully agree to you. And then we are on track. That is the good thing. So vulnerability, physical vulnerability, we discussed. Tomorrow, let us discuss on this topic of social vulnerability, and let us we have plenty of examples to show you from the basket.